Hello out there, and welcome to the No Shit Cast. I'm your host, Matt Frazier. Sitting in the hot seat with me tonight, my co-pilot for the festivities, the great wizard of historical knowledge himself, Mr. Eric Smith. How you doing tonight, Eric?
Like a person that's doing so well, you have to post something on Facebook and small little provocative tidbits.
I deserve that, don't I? After the last show going, you don't have anything to say
swell. That's what I said last time. I'm doing swell.
Yeah. Let's stick with that.
Okay. Swell. I'm doing swell.
Joining us on the show tonight, back by popular demand, Mr. Shifu Ramon Careaga is on the line with us. He's coming to talk to us about one of his papers that I've just found fascinating. And so he'll be joining us. He's actually with us right now. I shouldn't say like he's going to show up here. How you doing tonight, Shifu?
I'm doing more than swell. I'm doing swimmingly.
See, right there, man. That's it.
Fan groovalicious.
That's the way
right.
it goes.
All sorts of
positive
euphemisms.
things.
Yeah.
Let the sunshine.
I'm doing prodigious.
Prodigious. Wait, I got to get a dictionary now.
I'm feeling loquacious. How about you?
There we go.
Jeez.
It's good for podcasting. Though.
And straight off the rails, ladies and gentlemen. So, Shifu was kind enough to join us tonight to come talk to us about his paper. And this is Gaelic, I think, right? Shifu, this name is Caer Melyn?
No, it is Cumric or Welsh.
Oh.
And it's Caer Melyn.
Okay.
And you can hear, of course, how that would in the French going from Brittany into France, so it would be kind of bastardized into Camelot.
Okay.
But Caer means fort, and Melyn means like yellow brown.
Okay.
And basically the color of Saturn. So if you can picture Saturn, that is Melyn.
Okay.
And it is related to the Greek word, and there's probably a whole reason why that had come over related to the original Brits being founded by Brutus, who was from Troy.
Okay.
So that's probably how that word got into the Welsh language. But and now their script was called Colbran, and contrary to the popular belief, Colbran is not new. It is not a forgery. It was added to by Iolo Morgan, but I have proven that's what I'm speaking about on Sunday at the AKJ. I've shown through the plasma glyphs and using Chinese scripts and the previous papers I had done, both the Sumo paper and the Shangdi Heaven and Tao paper, that there are plasma glyphs contained in the Chinese scripts, but when you actually compare them with Colbran, you find out that there's overlap. Now, unless anybody's arguing that the Welsh and the Chinese had a conversation, there must be a legitimacy between them. And there's no disputing the Shang and Lu Shitong scripts authenticity. So it's only the Colbran that's under fire. And it's really kind of unfortunate because there's a lot of proof, and that's in my Camelot paper, that it goes back to at least 490 AD, which is way before Iolo Morgan was alive. So he was a bard who inherited things. Yeah, he embellished a lot. He added a lot. Most of those characters of history did. That's a problem in Chinese studies. It's a problem in any field. In biblical studies, some of the most fervent believers who would copy the Gospels, they would actually add things to the Gospels. And it's not that they were trying to disrespect the originals. They were trying to improve on the intent. But unfortunately, that creates a lot of copy errors. So Iolo, he just kind of embellished the stories. But he had gone around the countryside and had read these stones all over Wales and had gathered that knowledge, and then he got sort of semi-famous off of it. He enjoyed the rest of his life. He had a hard time in the early part of his career, but once some of his works, I guess you would say, went viral.
Right.
I don't know. They were hits. Let's say he was a New York Times bestseller.
Okay.
For the 1700s, and then he had a lot of students, and that created a schism. And the mainstream of academia in England had decided, along about the late 19th century, that everything that he did was a fake and a fraud,
Okay.
and that's not true. It's sort of like saying Sequoia invented the entire alphabet. It's not really reasonable. Nobody in history can be credited to invent an entire alphabet, let alone Sequoia or YOLO. And in my opinion, this is just one more method in which the Victorian era tried to marginalize anything that was not Anglo-Saxon.
Well, let me put this in context here, okay?
Sure.
So what we're talking about is, so the paper is the cosmic Hillfort of the king, the yellow Hillfort as a cosmic hill or mountain motif and symbol of the king's authority. Now, the abstract of this paper, and this is what you're talking to in the conversation that we're having here, is the existence of a real Camelot should not be doubted, but the yellow fort is not in England, since it was always in Wales, where the original British kings lived, and Glamorgan and Gwent. There were 38 generations from Brutus to Troy to King Arthur II, who is the Arthur of the Round Table. And the location of, that's that word you pronounced for me earlier, the work has already been performed, however, has the real Camelot from the perspective of the Saturn Jupiter myth, using some of its archetypes and motifs in order to ultimately evaluate its relationship to the divine right to rule and the rose-colored memory of a shining castle on a hill. So
That's right.
Okay, so you're making an argument here that things have been omitted and that there's clear evidence for it, because, again, as your papers always are, they're clearly and robustly documented, right? So people can go and check these out for yourself. But so to boil this down the argument that you're making here is that Camelot's not made up. The second King Arthur was the Arthur of the Round Table, right?
Right.
And that this place, this cosmic Hillfort of the king, actually exists, but it's not where the reason they think that the Arthur myth is a myth, per se, is because they're looking in the wrong places for the archaeological evidence to support it, right?
It's funny you say that. If you look on page 2, okay, I've got you the coordinates. So you can go visit, you can drive on the M4 and go visit this hill. It's not really hidden. If you look at the LiDAR for Cardiff area, they've retracted for the public the LiDAR for this section. So they know that there's stuff there. And in fact, I don't have the photos at this time, but I did receive word back from the photographer we hired from the AKHA. We've paid money to have 3D, 2D photographs done using a drone, and we're going to have a 3D model made of this hill, because there are.
Now wait a minute. Where's this hill at? Is this in the UK or is this?
It is. It
okay.
is. It's just north of Cardiff.
Okay.
So it is controlled by the Cardiff City Council.
No, look. The reason I bring that up is because I thought. Okay, we talked to Rick Osman, right? That's Graves of the Golden Bear. Yeah. Does this tie into the same
yes.
Arthur? Okay. Okay.
Yes. But he's dealing mostly with thematic myth, and when we go to the map, we'll go over to America, and you'll see the difference. But we should start in Wales so that you can understand where all of it was happening, where Glamorgan and Gwent was.
And
it's
this
in
is
Wales. It's in
this
South
paper
Wales.
is available at academia.edu/Shifu Careaga. If anybody wants to go, you can go pull these down. This is all out there for you to go look at. Sorry,
yes.
I wanted to make sure I put that out there up front this time. Go ahead.
No, it's totally important that people understand too that I did not do that research. I'm only here to connect it to the to the EPEMC and to Dave Talbot's work on the Saturn myth, because of course, for the electric universe to be a valid hypothesis, it needs to make predictions. And in this paper, we actually do make a prediction, and I've left it up here so that you can see the prediction that I have made. and you'll actually see the update to the map, and we'll do it all live. So the guys who did this was Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett. Now they produced a stunning work called Arthwys Rex Discovered, in which they have the headstone. So these guys followed the stones. They read the text in Colburn. A lot of these stones are just laying in church garages and carports. I mean, I'm not kidding. You could just pull up as a tourist. You can go to Wales using my map, and you can go find these places. And if locals will tell you where the stones are, you can go find 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century stones that have stuff on them. Forget Stonehenge. These things have writing. And you can walk up to them and you can feel the writing with your hands. So all they did was they translated using the known Colburn to English translation. Mr. Wilson himself is Welsh, and he had grown up hearing these different Bardsian tales. Apparently, people in Wales, they still speak Cymru, all right, over there. They speak Welsh. And a lot of the names of the places are practically unpronounceable from an English perspective, which England was called Logres at the time. And so they just followed this stuff around, and eventually they found the church where he would have been buried, and it's St. Peter's Church. It's still there. They bought it. They bought the church. Nobody wanted it, right? The people, they sold it out to them. They dug around the outside and found the headstone, produced the book, and then were blocked by the Cardiff City Council from ever excavating under that church. So they still own that church. No one will excavate it. Furthermore, they have found a hill that they have identified, and they maintain that it could be, because there's a non-ferrous box deep down, that there could be the Ark buried in there. That also has been blocked from being excavated.
The Ark. The Ark,
yes.
Ark of the Covenant Ark?
And Ark, whatever Ark would have followed St. Joseph of Arimathea. So they have a book on St. Joseph. They have a lot of Christian work. In fact, most of their research appears to be early Christian histories. Now, to sweeten this, to get it out of the realm of myth, if you go to Llandaff in Wales at this point in time, they have a Bible there that has in the margin what are called the Llandaff Charters. And anybody can wiki the Llandaff Charters. There's translations of the Llandaff Charters. So what had happened is, in that time, the British, when we say British, we don't mean Anglo-Saxon. We mean the descendants of Brutus. They had a tradition where the king owned the land, and then they would give out royal charters to the church. The church then operating on that, any type of land contracts that went around, they would record it in the margins of the Bible, which sounds really strange to us, but it's quite handy that they did. And you can even find things like when King Arthur II's grandfather was excommunicated for killing his brother. And then later on, they reinstituted him because he donated some land. So he had a political battle with these bishops and then came back in. But they were Christians. They were Christians from way back before. This is after the Romans had left or had been driven out, or the Roman Empire had fallen, or whatever. So they had been Christian now for a couple hundred years. And when the Anglos and Saxons, mostly Saxons, started arriving, they were still pagans. And they were Germanic peoples, and so all these foreign invaders that were Saxon, they were all pagans, but the Welsh in Glamorgan and Gwent were Christians, and so frequently on these stones are a lot of references to the one God, to the Lord, etc.
Okay.
All right, lots of reference to that, and that comes up again in the stones that are here in the Ohio River Valley. Okay, so
that's there's one of the connections you're saying to Graves of the Golden Bear and what these gentlemen have found in the UK.
Well, that's we'll get to Matic. So let's go back to Camelot. Okay.
Okay.
Now the important thing that people need to understand about the difference between the real Arthurian kingdom and what we imagine as castles is that they didn't have Norman-style castles with 30-foot thick stone walls that were yay high, and though that was a castle that somebody who taxed heavily the population and needed to worry about being invaded from its own people, they didn't have that in Glamorgan. What they had instead was a ring system of forts, and each one of these, I guess, kind of like a general fort area, was controlled by either a prince or a king. Lots of kings. They had many kings, like dozens of kings. And they would get together and they would elect a high king. Because Arthur's family had those 38 generation connections all the way back, his family sort of was presumably the best to lead, or the ones to lead. However, they still had to win the vote, and they could actually lose the vote. And they fought each other mercilessly. These people were cavalry and infantry and art of war savants. They defeated Caesar twice and drove him out. And then they made some deals with him. There was also some betrayals, which we won't get into, that caused them to be opened up to the Romans, and the Romans installed a fort on the river Usk, which the remains are there. If you go to Caerleon today, there's a hospital, and then down the hill from the hospital, there's a river Usk, and next to it there is a stone ruins of a Roman fort. But that is not the real Caerleon, and it's not Camelot. That is something that the Romans used to levy taxes and maintain their control over the area for the brief time that they were there. And the British, for their part, they also got benefits. So they laid roads, and they made big trade. People went to Italy. They shared names. And in fact, if you go to page 5 there, you can see a list of Welsh kings who were who were part of the imperial list, because King Arthur the First went off and conquered
it says
through Europe.
A list of British lords and parallel Roman emperors. So it shows. So this is all based on time, like which ones lined up and were in power at the same time, kind of thing.
Right, and then you can see when names match up, and some of them are more obvious, and some of them are less obvious. But the point is that after King Arthur the First went through and conquered all the way down to Rome, they made peace with each other and actually strengthened the bloodline. It was considered really quite valuable that the British had a line back to Brutus of Troy. Now, the entire denial of that origin was centered around the idea that Troy was a myth, and they had been promulgating that denial between Iolo's time and when Troy was discovered. And after Troy was discovered in the mid-1800s, they just went silent on the matter.
By Schliemann?
Yeah, by Schliemann. And so when Troy was discovered, that should have basically validated British history. But instead, they set about attacking Iolo's work and saying that what a liar he was. To me, this sounds remarkably similar to what happened here in America with the denial about the forts. And on top of that, the general denial among archaeology of many different cultures, origin stories, and things that they have said about their own people. And to this day, there's a lot of oral history of Aborigines around the world that is denied by mainstream archaeology and anthropology because it just, quote, can't be.
Okay.
Well, we live in a time when Clovis First is being overturned, so I don't really want to hear that it can't be. The question is, did they have any reason to lie? Whoever chiseled these stones in the 5th and 6th centuries and 4th centuries, they didn't really have any reason to lie about their own history. They just wanted to record, when these people lived and how things happened. There was a lot of backstabbing. It's it's an endless Game of Thrones, to be honest with you. It is a continual Game of Thrones because every one of them is a king. Wales, as small a country as it seems to us, was really like 30 different kingdoms. And so they were at continual warfare with each other. However, this is the point. When they would be invaded, they immediately all would band together because they had a ring fort system.
It almost sounds like, Shifu, that it would be almost better to, instead of describing them as kingdoms, it probably would make more make more sense in my mind to almost regard them as more like tribes that were constantly.
But
they had kings, right? But it was very tribal. Right. More it wasn't like, because when I think of a king, I think of someone that owns the sovereignty of an entire nation, right? But
that time, the High King had the sovereignty of Britain.
Okay.
And mostly of what they could control, right?
Yeah.
But he was also the High King. He still was the High King of Brittany in France as well. So all of the area where the British people were, the High King was the king.
Okay.
And then there were individual kings and princes who controlled, well, you would say it was fiefdoms. And then they were surrounded by tribal peoples. Now, the Irish or Celtic peoples that they share common, they had basically the same system. And so they would intermarry with them and support each other. And by the time of King Arthur II, Ireland had also become Christian. So there was commonality between them. And that's when, they were constantly being invaded by Angles, Saxons, and the Picts had come along and they had already given them leave to settle up in the north. And so they went up there. But as far as the British, they were art of war savvy because they had learned from the Romans. They were armored and rode cavalry, and they fought like demons. But they didn't breed very much compared to Germanic peoples. They just didn't have really huge families, and they were at war all the time. There was a lot of intrigue, and of course, famously, Arthur II's nephew Modred, or we call Modred, tried to take over the kingdom. He had just gone over to Brittany, and while he was gone, Modred came up and tried to take over. So they were constantly at war within themselves. But what made them difficult to conquer was that they had this ring fort system. And the ring forts, they were, first of all, on top of hills.
Oh, you're talking about Moat and Bailey, right? Moat and Bailey castle fortifications built on top of hills.
Yeah, but they didn't really put moats, so I don't want to say moats. They didn't really do the whole moat and then drawbridge type of situation. Picture more of like a knob, like we have here in the Ohio River Valley, and then a fort on top of that.
Gotcha. With a palisade wall?
Yeah,
like a wooden palisade
wall, but a stone one. It was crude stonework. So,
but not like curtain walls and stuff like that, right?
Right. It wasn't that.
So it wasn't as advanced
in that way. Yeah. So when you go there now, almost every single one of these is just a pile of stones covered in grass now, which is what on Caer Melyn, which is called the Yellow Hill, where there is a farm that was called the Yellow Farm, and there's sulfur springs on that hill. They look just like earthworks. They just look like piles. You're not going to see beautiful castles. Now, there are beautiful castles that came along later as the Normans invaded, and they rebuilt things, and the Saxons, and they did build beautiful castles that are in Cardiff that you can go to. But the old kingdom of, if you could want to call the whole thing Camelot, but it's really Glamorgan and Gwent, that whole thing has become like literally grass. And the people, there's loads of mounds. It is easy to assume that they're all burial mounds, but they're not. There's a lot of them are just these forts. And some of them have been turned into, in fact, Caer Melyn itself, the vast majority of it, if you zoom in on Google Earth, is now a neighborhood. It's like a city. And so there's almost nothing of it left. Several of the locations, when you zoom in using the map, you're going to find that it's mostly city, and there might be like a roundabout, and that might be what's left, essentially, of that kingdom. So from there, how to describe? So you have a series of events that happen in King Arthur's time, and it's really important. So King Arthur the First, Arthfael, he was the big time conqueror, but even he had not taken over the whole of the island. He had focused his intents on the Romans. When Tudrig or Theoderic becomes king, he is beset all about by invasions from Saxons, and there's not quite control of North Wales, and the Picts are making alliances with Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, and the larger part of what we call England and Scotland are not anymore under strict control of the British. That period of conquest had passed. So Theoderic hatches kind of a plan. Uh, they say it's hard to defend against raiders who come in the night and they steal from your coastal towns, and then they go out to sea. And so why don't we let them settle? And so they have a whole council. They let some of these towns, these Anglo-Saxon towns, swell with thousands of people, but they are not armored very well. They fight. They have leather shields, very good for fighting as far as Aboriginal and tribal warfare goes, but not necessarily going to work against heavy cavalry. And then he retires. His son Maurice or Muerig takes over, but he develops like a lame leg, and while he's still a young king, but fortunately he has a son, and he decides to name him after Arthfael, so he calls him Arthwys, which is sometimes written as Arthwir, which is where Arthur comes from. And when he's only 15 years old, of course, he sends him off to be trained by Merlin in the north of Wales, almost like on the coast, to learn the Druidic ways, because he decides that if he sent him to learn from the bishops, basically Christianity would weaken the nation, and they would lose their some of their Celtic background. So he sends him to Merlin. Merlin teaches him the arts of war, and so he comes back at age 15. They are invaded almost immediately by a Saxon army, you would say, 25 to 30,000 strong. And Arthur successfully, despite him being only a boy king, so they thought they would be an easy invasion because you have a boy king and a lame king. And the lame king had stepped aside because of politics so that the boy king could be made paramount king. But he hadn't proven himself yet. And not every one of the princes and kings of Wales showed up to actually help in that defense. So the Saxons invade with this army, and he successfully defeats them and overcomes them, and he slays them almost down to the last one. I mean, he uses brilliant art of war tactics and these hill forts to their advantage, and the heavy cavalry inflicts just massive damage. So the Saxons of England decide to sue for peace, and they never, in his lifetime at least, they don't make war on him again. But a few years later, like maybe 12 years later, there is a great battle up in the north of England, almost what you would say Scotland. And the Saxons kill off like 350 of these princes. And of course, some of them are probably lesser princes, and some of them are more proud princes. But the bottom line is they weren't centrally organized, and they thought that they would easily defeat these Saxons because the British at that time really looked down on the Saxons because they weren't Christian, and they didn't wear metal armor and all these certain things. So the devastation up there swells the pride of the Saxons. They make a huge alliance, and Arthur spends the next year gathering all these different kings, including from Ireland, from Brittany, from Cornwall, his uncle Constantine the Wolf, who is incredibly brutal, and then some of his childhood schoolmates who are now princes and kings of their own, particularly King Maelgwyn, who is our Sir Lancelot. And they form an alliance, and they go on a tear and defeat the Saxons in 12 successive battles, and people can read about this as well. The 12 battles are each individually incredibly brilliantly done. There's a mixture of timing and the use of terrain and drawing the opponent out and cutting them off. There's one time he marches them south and they fake like they're going home, like they're satisfied with their campaign. And then the scouts are almost ready to leave. They've already told them, hey, they're gone. The armies of the Saxons are dispersing. And then he flips them around and he comes right back at them and he just wipes them all out. And only those who submit to the rule of the paramount king are then allowed to live. There's a lot of people that even flee back on boat to go back to the mainland of Europe. But he did not ultimately wipe out all of the Saxons and Picts. He made the Picts promise the same age-old tradition of you provide a wife and we'll provide the husband, and that's how the rule will happen. And not that long afterwards, something happens that nobody could have foreseen, which is that the Vandals fell and had to flee from Carthage and that entire North African area, and they try to invade Ireland. And so Arthur, he takes his army over there to fight, and then the Vandals, being really good at what they do, they just came over to Wales and marched as quick as they could to about where Birmingham is and established the Mercian Empire. And from then on, because of the civil war between Arthur II and his nephew Medrawd, and the fact that Arthur II's, all four of his first sons that were from Guinevere, the first Guinevere's lineage, all four sons died in the Mercian Wars. And so he has to marry the second wife, and Medrawd tries to take her. And he kills them both. He chases them up to the north of Wales, and then he kills Modred, and he has the second wife torn to pieces by the hounds. And then he marries the third wife, and they have another son named Morgan, and this would be Morgan the second, although not of the same lineage. He had an uncle named Morgan, but who he named after. They had a tradition where they didn't name their sons after themselves, and so they didn't use a last name tradition. Really, it was always something like Arthwys ap Muerig, meaning Arthur, son of Maurice. And so he named his new heir after what's called the Edling, after his uncle. And that Morgan had a hell of a time to try and keep the kingdom together. And there was a split in South and North Wales, never were fully unified again, which of course enabled the Anglo-Saxons to take hold, and the rest is history. So by the time of the third Arthur and the fourth Arthur, things were already really quite on the decline. So King Arthur II and his round table, his place of round meeting where everybody's equals, was the pinnacle. It would be, I guess, the Silver Age, because the Golden Age, of course, would be from Brutus of Troy all the way through the defeating and King Arthur I. But his age, that trilogy of kings, was so hailed because they had gone forth and defeated the Saxons and the Picts and everybody, and the whole of the island for the first time in its history since they first arrived was actually now controlled by the Britons. But by the time you get past King Edward, the Longshanks, it becomes illegal, really. He could never really defeat them in battle because they were quite fierce. But they did beat them with politics, the same way the Romans did.
We're talking about Longshanks here.
Yeah. And so he has a prince, he has a pregnant queen sent over to Wales, and she gives birth in Wales, and he claims kingship by right of the prince being Welsh. And so the Wales is taken over, not the hard way, but the smart way, and it's never really been independent ever since. And by the time you get to the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, it becomes illegal to teach schools they take out all of the Welsh teachers and they send in English speaking teachers, and it becomes illegal to speak Welsh in the school. So they try to generationally wipe out the Welsh speaking population. It isn't successful. Much the same as in Australia when they tried that.
Yeah.
It wasn't successful, and instead, of course, created resentment. So to this day, the Welsh people are quite proud to speak Welsh. The names of their towns are in Welsh. You don't see on Google Maps. You do not see the English names. You're seeing the Welsh names of these locations. There
Right.
are anglicized names for everything. Some of them are Latin based, and some of them are
the
Anglo.
point was to come in like and just erase that history.
Yeah,
obviously.
that's exactly right.
And the motivation there being that this was a conquered people, and that's kind of how business was done, sort of back then
that's
as
pretty
well,
much
right?
how it's that's pretty much how it's done all over. But I think that it's
Now,
a little.
At
It's
some
a little
point,
bit
though,
more-
right? This got turned into not history; it got turned into a myth.
That's
right?
the part. That's the part that, to me, I mean, the wiping out of the language is bad enough.
Okay.
If people want to understand more of that story, Lee has a book, a DVD called Wales History and Bondage.
Okay.
But to me, what really blows my mind is the tendency in Anglo-Saxon archaeology, controlled out of London, Oxford, etc., to basically disassemble and discount with the authority of doctorates and letters after your name, especially any work of anybody who's dead and they can't fight back, all this history that happened before, and to say that it's not valid and that it's gone. And the reason that this comes up again is because we have Welsh stones here in the Ohio River Valley. In particular, there's an area in Kentucky where we have these two different mound cultures of the post-Hopewell tradition. One is the Mississippian, and we have a heck of a time talking about that because the mainstream doesn't want to admit that they might be Nahuatl people. But when you look at the Cherokee myths, that's what it seems like. They seem like Nahuatl people. And when you read what the Chinese say about their visit, they sound like they were heart sacrificers, the same way that you would find among the Mexica. And then you have this other mound culture called the Fort Ancient. And the Fort Ancient, there's almost silence around who they could possibly be. Now, if you overlap where the Welsh stones, the Roman coins, and the Hillforts that are found from Georgia to Indiana, Ohio down to southwestern Kentucky, if you overlap all of these, they overlap with the Fort Ancient mound culture.
What do you mean by their designs? Is that what you mean? They overlap?
They don't just overlap in the fact that there is a technological leap for the Native American culture.
Okay.
And the fact that they're suddenly building stone forts at Stone Mountain, at Old Fort, at Berea's Indian Fort, at the Devil's Backbone at Charlestown's State Park in Indiana, which you are not allowed to even climb that hill. They won't let you even go up on it. These stone forts would represent a major departure in Native American culture, but it's a literal overlap in terms of the area where they're at. And there's also an exact overlap in terms of time, because when they date these, they go back right into that sweet spot of when the Madoc myth says that Madoc came over here. Now, Madoc being one of the brothers of a second mother. So
Brothers
Maurice, of
from
course,
another
had.
mother.
Yeah. So yes, exactly. So they were Christian, but like many Christians of that era, the men, especially the nobility, they could have more than one wife, and his father Maurice had more than one wife, and so Madoc was not an heir to the empire, but he was a noble prince. And he had, by accident of the cataclysm of like the 535, 565, depends on, if you include the 30-year gap, because of Jesus' life, they had different datings for when they would start zero. he apparently was blown off course, and he comes back and reports that he had found this land, and it's all in the stones. Don't believe me? Just go read the books by Wilson and Blackett, and you can read the translations of these stones. These are academic books. These are not narrative books. If people want the short narrative version, they should read Adrian Gilbert's The Holy Kingdom. And in it, he has the Land of Charters. He has a lot of translations in there for you. He describes all this.
Now, forgive me for being a literary mental midget here, because I am a bit. But does this all eventually tie back into this whole? Am I right? Called the Merovingian bloodlines that are supposed to trace their way back to Jesus Christ, right? To show some,
well,
is that
maybe,
what that is, or am I just making shit up here?
It might in some way. They haven't specifically mentioned that I've come across, but
Okay.
instead, what they talk about a lot is the Lost 10 Tribes. They talk about the movement of
The Lost 10 Tribes.
Defeated Hebrews up to Crimea and also over to Italy. And there is an overlap. You can use Colburn to translate Etruscan, and also to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can actually render a translation. I don't know how coherent it is.
So you're saying there's at least there's a path through the way they design their structures, through the way they structured their languages.
No, I don't know if there's if the spoken language. I do not know enough about Welsh to say that, but
okay.
I will say that the revered glyph, which we call the Alwyn glyph, which basically looks like a forward slash, a downward slash, and then a backward slash. Looks like three fingers painted down.
Okay.
That is known as the Yao, and the Yao means Yasu Alpha Omega. And of course, it's the same sound heard worldwide, the Yao or Yahoo or Yahweh. And it does mean the creator, preserver, destroyer. It is the secret name for God, and it's a secret name for God in the Holy Land, and it's a secret name for God also in Wales. So that might prove that the language and the religion come from the same place. I'm not going to make that leap, but what I will say is that you can use the Colburn to read it, and so Colburn script, it has ancient ties to at least Etruscan. You can use it to look at the Hebrew, but the Hebrew scripts, from what I can tell, are a little bit more. They're a lot closer, not a little bit. They're a lot closer to the original Taurus that was up there, and that's a whole different episode of talking about where Hebrew came from. People have to be familiar. Just look up Hebrew Taurus origins, and you can see how you can get all the Hebrew shapes from the toroid. So that may have been a tie in terms of the holy, how they became Christian and everything. There would be a reason for these saints and these martyrs to leave the persecuted Middle East area just after Jesus had died, and then go all the way up to Britain. There would have been knowledge through probably across the Iberian coast. Okay. There are areas. My family lands were in Basque, right?
Okay.
And Basque is the country that was at the border from Spain to France. It's now just part. Well, Britons themselves, to this day, love to vacation there and maintain that although they don't speak French or Spanish, that they have been in that area for thousands of years. And so there probably was a port of call in between, and as people cut across the isthmus there of Iberia, they may have needed a port for them to get from there up to Brittany, and then from Brittany to England and Wales.
So is the implication then that at some point the actual bloodline was hijacked somehow? And
there is a side conspiracy theory that basically there was a swap, and that the current Queen Elizabeth and all of her recent family, that's not the original Tudor line at all, and the Tudor line, that's not the original line either. But I haven't read enough up on that to.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised. I have read that Princess Diana, although she was said to be of Wales, that actually she would not have been allowed to be princess if she weren't actually Anglo-Saxon. So there is new archaeological research showing that British people have blood that goes back to the Middle East, and not even recently, like up to 6,000 years ago. So there may have been an ancient crossroads where people were walking this thing, and who knows? Maybe it's related to what we were talking about earlier with the mega tsunami. Maybe people were just following it back and were like, "Hey, I can go from the Bosporus Strait all the way back to the UK." I mean, when you go back 6,000 years, Doggerland still existed. So there was plenty of land up in between Scandinavia and England.
That's
to
something
have
that's been popping up in the news here recently a lot too. I've seen it's flooded now, right? It's underwater right now.
Well, yeah, it sank. It sank down. It's not flooded. You'll see people claiming that the islands in the South Pacific are being flooded by the climate change. That's not true. These islands are still sinking. There's a lot of these lands that are still sinking down into the ocean, and they have been since this cataclysmic event 12,000 years ago. Doggerland is no exception, and they've found mammoth bones. The fishermen have dragged up mammoth bones and sloths and all sorts of stuff. So there is no doubt among academics that Doggerland is real at this point. I don't know if the implication culturally has been found, and what it really means that in terms of the Hyperborean story and the age. How does it in the movie, in the intro of Conan, he's like between the sinking of Atlantis and the rise of the kings of Arius, there's an age undreamt of.
Drank Atlantis and the age of the kings of Akros.
That's right. And this area, and remember what in that story, Conan himself is a Cimmerian with a C, Cimmerian. Well, there appears to be a tie from the Welsh people back to the Crimean area, and Crimea is still a hotbed for action. So, historically speaking, this has been a contentious lineage, and maybe it has to do with who's going to rule what. I don't really have anything big to say on that. I only have, with respect to Camelot, my speculations as to how the hill would have been chosen in relation to the Saturn myth to emphasize the divine right to rule, because worldwide you have this connection. In fact, as late as the guy who came immediately before the Han Dynasty, Qin Shi Huangdi. Why is he called Huangdi? Huangdi was him naming himself after the legendary emperor Huangdi, who Dave Talbot, of course, speculates that there was no such real Huangdi, that was just Saturn, that he was the heaven man, or the king in the sky, the great man, some places called.
Huangdi sounds like a great rapper name, doesn't it? Like Huangdi.
Huangdi. Yeah,
Huangdi.
this yellow emperor. What does it mean? I've already shown you the evidence for mankind seeing Saturn and Jupiter. If people can't believe that, then they'll just have to read those papers.
Well, you made that correlation too. I think in modern art with I think it was the movie Star Wars, right? The Death Star exploding, and
sure.
Why that's such a why do people find that so cathartic? And you tie that back into
that's the Venus myth.
That's the Venus myth, right? Okay,
but they are related because in terms of when Saturn fell, and he was the fertility god, right? And he fell either to his brother or to his son, depending on the myth. And I think that only depended on how big Jupiter appeared at the time that the myth was being told. Because at one period, Jupiter would have appeared far away and would have grown in size to like a sun would grow. And then the king, he becomes a female. And almost ubiquitously, the original one king, he loses his manhood and becomes female. And then by the time of the Greeks, Saturn becomes Hera, the sister queen. And of course, it has to be a sister queen because the original myth for Ra at that time of his divine right to rule was that he was his own mother and that he would marry his sister and give birth to himself, and that he lived inside of his own egg, and that all had to do with the plasma sheath. So, but now when you get down to the Greek ages, that had to be translated somehow. So, you have Zeus marrying his sister Hera, and they rule together. But when you read the story, they more or less kind of are at each other's throats all the time. They don't really quite get along, and they send their heroes against each other, and et cetera. Now, the people in the north, they interpreted that differently. They looked at it as two different sets of gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, and that's the same. The Hindus did the same thing, right? They saw it as two different families. They were related families, but they were at war anyways. This is the famous Mahabharata situation where Arjuna despairs that he has to slay his this wonderful array of family members, and he decides to throw down his weapons, and Krishna says, don't do that because then you'll be a coward and you have to fight this battle. It's a very famous poem called the Bhagavad Gita. So
Fell from the sky.
This battle, go ahead.
I just said fell from the sky.
Yeah.
Right. So he falls from the sky, and what takes his place is Jupiter. But Jupiter's time is cut short by Gilgamesh slaying the bull of heaven. And so the age of Taurus comes to an end after only 1,500 years or so. And after that, now is the time of Inanna, or what are some of her other names? You have Aphrodite, Diana, right? She's a warrior. Sometimes she's male and sometimes she's female. She's bearded. This is a strange feature. She has horns. And then also Mars, Ares, comes and will fight with her. And in some traditions, actually, he's the babe suckling from her breast. And so what you had originally was the yin-yang pairing as father and son. And then it's usurped by this battle between male and female. Then Zeus sends Athena away because she's beating up Ares, basically. And then now you have another exchange of father to son, and the birth of the Christ prophecy in Egypt and the Middle East and around the world, the belief in this rising of a Messiah. And then Mars, according to the Chinese, Hou Yi, he shoots an arrow and slays 9 out of 10 of the moons. And in Rome, at the same period, the Caesars would slay 9 out of 10 bulls in a single festival. And then he too goes away. Mars goes away, and all that's left is the moon. That's the one bull that wasn't slayed, or the one star that wasn't shot. And the age of gods comes to an end, and instead, the age of religion begins. We have, of course, that transition period that is, a few hundred years. Depends on where you're at in the world. Sometimes it takes longer for that transition period to end. And the gods were revered, especially in America, for a long, long time.
Now, all of these events that you're talking about up until this point were things that people were literally seeing happen in the sky, right?
Yeah.
This was all driven by the connection is that it was all driven by planetary bodies and heavenly bodies that were doing things that created all of these myths.
Correct.
That flow from that, right?
Right. Well, you have to think, nothing in nature comes from nothing. So where would the concept of gods come from? We really only have one place, and it's well known. I mean, it's not like Velikovsky was the guy who discovered all this. Actually, you have writings, Strabo and Plato. I mean, these guys were all writing about the planet gods, and they were very clear about it. They would say things specifically like Shamash was Saturn, was the superior sun. They would say the superior sun because they had to emphasize the difference between the golden era that we lived in and the era that followed. And you had this strange conversation in Critias Timaeus where this Greek guy is talking to an Egyptian, like Solon is talking to this Egyptian priest, and the priest is telling him, you Greeks don't know anything because there was a wave that came and wiped out your whole civilization, and everything that you think is new is actually old news. You don't have the whole story. And so the Egyptians, of course, had it all on stone, so they could come back and they could read it, And depending on the culture, the older cultures like the Chinese and the Egyptians will say that we're under the seventh sun, and then the middle ones will say under the fifth sun, and the newest cultures will say under the third sun. So, take your pick as to what they mean by sun. But in the case of Saturn, it does appear that it was a very tiny brown dwarf star, and it flared. And when it flared, there was some major changes that the solar system underwent. And that work, if people want to read more about it, is Eduardo Cardona, who's now deceased. His series of books, he's got God Star and Flare Star, all on down the line. You can also just look up the documentaries by the Thunderbolts Project, such as Thunderbolt of the Gods and Discourses of an Alien Sky, etc. There's a whole Symbols of an Alien Sky. There's a whole series of things that will show the cross-comparative myths. Now, these myths can be used over and over again to make predictions in other cultures. The way that they interpret those motifs may be different, but the forms and shapes repeat over and over again, such to the point that where a script like Rongo Rongo totally mystifies and defies mainstream and linguistic decrypting, you have Dr. Robert Schoch going, and he's looking at these going, wow, these are looking a lot like these other glyphs.
He's from Boston University. He's the guy that says that the Sphinx is much older than accepted. Okay.
Yes. So he's now on this wavelength because he's looking at it going, well, here are these Paratian plasma shapes showing up in Rongo Rongo on some island that nobody visited. And we know when somebody first visited there because the natives say, oh, yeah, you're the first to come since the time when the entire continent fell in the ocean and we're all that's left of that continent. And those people, they maintain that they were there, that their people were there when the continent fell in. And then when, Cook and those, that era of explorers show up and meet them, and nobody between either group can read the Rongo Rongo. Well, probably because it's not a strict language as much as it is a recording of phase changes in the plasma shapes that were up in the sky, whether you want to call them thunderbirds or gods or angels or Nephilim, it doesn't, giants, whatever you want to call them.
That's that like shapes. Burning Man shape with the guy that's got.
There's a lot of them. Yeah. There's not just that one. There's centipedes and giant birds, and there's. Now
the connection with all of those glyphs and petroglyphs and things is that these imagery, whatever, show up like all over the planet, everywhere, and they're extremely similar. So the way that kind of ties into this is that again, like the ancient gods, is that this is something that everybody on the planet was all sort of seeing at the same time, and they were just recording it on like cave walls and things, and that is an indication of so the summation there is what they were seeing was the energy that was being exchanged by these heavenly bodies in the form of like corona or aurora borealis and different stuff like that, right? Plasma
formations. And now the Chinese, they took a really scientific approach to it, but they also were worshiping it, and just as the Hebrews were. The civilized old world cultures and some of the civilized new world cultures, they tended to, after the gods disappeared, to form what we would recognize as religion. So they formed power structures that were politically and economically motivated to dominate aboriginals and their own populations. And that would include industrial slavery rather than just conquest slavery. And the formations of institutions of learning centered around especially the Messiah function and also the maintenance of the belief in the one Lord, or at least in the case of India, multiple one lords who all represented really a general greater lord. So you have all the different types of Hindu schools; they all have their own version of the Atman or the Brahman, or they just choose, but they're all representing actually the one God. This is the thing that a lot of Westerners don't understand about Hinduism. So this way of looking at the world was kind of a progression from how it had been done previously. But a lot of the world, probably well over half of the population at that time, was still trying to maintain exactly the memory. So, like the Aborigines of Australia and the Dogon in Africa and the South Americans would repeat these stories over and over again as oral tradition, and it was actually a mark of pride for the chiefs and their families to know these histories. That would mean that you were an elite, right? Because you were an educated person, especially in any culture where there wouldn't be writing or particular books, like book learning. If you could orally recite these stories, then probably you were descended from the line of kings. And that was an important distinction between how mankind moved through the transition period. Some places transitioned towards what we would recognize as a proper religion, right? And other places stayed what we would call pagan. But the bottom line is all of it came originally from this Saturn, Jupiter, and Venus myth. And so far that even when America was already a country, by 1905, the Pawnee Skiddy were still performing heart sacrifices to Venus. And this Venus myth was is an incredibly important facet of our culture.
Right.
But in the Welsh tradition, they have long ago become Christian. So I don't maintain that Arthur and them had any personal knowledge. Like, I don't think that they were personally like a Autumn Ra cult or anything like that. We do have, of course, the famous story of King Tut and his family. His father Akhenaten tries to revive the religion of Autumn Ra, and is regarded as a heretic by that time. He even has his children marry, and so Tutankhamun marries his older sister, and their whole family, after they die, they try to erase the memory of this guy. So, people took religion seriously no matter what age it was. The Hebrews appear to have had a real existential crisis during the Exodus event while this whole Venus cataclysm is going on.
And they changed their Marna period art too.
Yeah, everywhere there was a real crisis of character, I think, between which god is going to be the one that you worship, and for the Hebrew, idolatry was this planet worship, and Moses was trying to get them off of that and onto this worship of this one Lord. But we don't know for sure that he meant a like kind of an ascendant god, or if he just meant a specific planet that he was favoring. Perhaps Mars or perhaps Venus. We don't know exactly.
Do you think that Amarna art tied into that in any significant way?
I haven't looked at the Amarna art lately, but what I've found is that you can't go to any of these, even to the Renaissance art, you can't get away from the Saturn Jupiter myth.
Yeah.
It just shows up over and over and over again. The depiction of God creating Adam, that is so famous, itself is just touched with Kronos references.
Are you talking about the one in the Sistine Chapel, like in the ceiling?
Yes, where he's creating Adam, he's reaching out. Okay.
Yep.
When you go and then you look at depictions of Kronos, you have basically the same idea of the father time figure. In fact, why we call it chronology as a reference to time is a reference to Kronos, because when Kronos fell, then became the count of the sun, who we call Sol. But the original Helios, according to all the alchemists and all of the ancient historians, who we have no reason to really doubt because they weren't, they had no profit, they had no grants, they weren't writing for peer-reviewed journals. According to them, Helios was Kronos. Helios was Saturn.
Do you think that Saturn is the genesis of Gnosticism?
I think that when mankind saw the Tao or logos. They were quite mystified by this presence of something more deep than, I mean, when you go hunting or hiking in the woods, let's say, if you're a hunter-gatherer 20, 30, 50,000 years ago, you feel a deep connection to what's around you. But I think when they actually saw these things and they started finding lodestone and experiencing magnetism, I would say that they sat around and they really tried to search it out. And I think eventually they unlocked the keys. And the story in Genesis about finding of the tree of knowledge may have been a discussion, sort of a campfire story, because it wasn't written at first, right? It was.
Do you think that Yggdrasil that corresponds to the Ka that they talk about in the Egyptian body parts?
Yes, the Ka and the Chi and the Ruach are all the same. They are all this Holy Spirit or energy passage. And it is kind of sometimes translated as soul, sometimes as spirit. The important part is that it's mysterious and it moves. And it is rather, if you look at the properties of Chi,
and produces Hika.
Most of them are properties of charge. There are some properties of Chi or Ka or Prana that are not replicable with charge, at least as we understand. Orgone, biomes, all of it. The natives just called it medicine. This energy that circulates, this vital breath, does appear to be the inspiration of most of the practical aspects of the religion, rather than, but again, the passage of the power from the Father to the Son, from Saturn to Jupiter, and then as they experienced or witnessed it, appears to be the foundation of when energetics entered into worship. I can't find any evidence that it existed before. We do know that people were doing trepanations and basic, really rudimentary medicine for thousands of years.
Sure.
But it didn't appear to be anything related to what we would call traditional medicines now, where there's massage and there's herbalism and all that kind of stuff.
Do you think that psilocybin had anything to do with that?
Yeah, well, this is I give some credence to Graham Hancock's argument that at famous places like Delphi and these caves where people were painting, they were painting really beautiful images, and then now they're painting really horrific things, which were probably related to cataclysms, that maybe they were using hallucinogens. I think there's probably really good evidence of that. They found that new shaman pouch down in South America, and there were still hallucinogenic.
They had both the components for DMT.
Yes,
right.
Yeah,
but that was
psychotropins often are connected with ancient world religions.
Yeah, but those were pretty recent, and I don't know that there's necessarily a ton of proof. The one big proof is in India, the famous drink Soma had hallucinogenic properties, and of course Harappa was right in the era that we're talking about. Harappa was about 7,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago.
Peyote for the American Indians, and flesh of the gods, which was psilocybin mushrooms for the Indians and Vedic traditions, and sweat lodges for Peruvians, and lots of different.
You've really researched this, haven't you?
Just to name a few, really, honestly.
Well, think about it.
No, he mentioned Delphi and stuff, which the fumes come up. And
just think about with kids these days, right? They experiment in college, and then pretty soon they're waxing philosophic on all sorts of topics. It makes total sense to me that if you want to try and understand the ineffable, that you're going to use things that bring you to an ineffable state where, as the Tao says, right, he who is speaking is not knowing, and he who is in the knowing is not speaking.
Are you familiar with the OR theory?
No, go ahead and tell me.
It stands for Orchestrated Reduction of Quantum Entangled Information in Microtubulars of the Brain, and basically it's a theory of quantum consciousness.
Makes sense to me.
It relies upon the cellular skeletal structure of cells in the neurons of your brain that are able to communicate on a quantum level with the quantum universe.
Yeah, there is some research that recently came out that showed that there are thoughts that are not propagated as action potentials. And
Right, they're
this may,
uncalculatable. Yeah.
right, it may relate to this concept, which again, Hancock in Supernatural, he explores the idea of a transponder type of consciousness where your brain is either either projecting basically EMF energy or receiving it, or some type of energy that is connecting to an underlying matrix-like consciousness.
This is
That's probably really how it works. And then, of course, using quantum discussion, baryons, etc. But I don't know if we're ever going to prove that or not.
well, this is a little different. This relies upon Roger Penrose's objective reduction, which is the idea that there isn't a multiverse but just one universe, because there's only about 6 probabilities that will crop up in space-time when things are in superposition before it pinches those off like buds and allows only one to exist. So one always comes out on top, which is the reduction. It reduces the quantum wave function essentially to a classical situation. And they believe that that's what goes on in the brain. On the edge of consciousness, you have some uncalculatable control over the collapsation of the quantum wave function that's propagated through the neural nodes in the brain. It's by Roger Penrose, who is from Oxford, and a guy named Stuart Hammerhoff, who is an anesthesiologist. And you can go and look at it on a website somewhere. I think they still have one.
What I have encountered, personally speaking, from my own personal experimentation with samadhi, with entheogens, with chi and yoga and spirit travel, astral travel, is that is basically the truth. The multiple quantum streams, they exist in parallel, but none of them are actualized. So there is all these other possibilities. It's interesting you mentioned 6 because that's an important number in the Chinese as well. But they reduce to the moment, and then all things become overlapped, like not really layers. It's more like Photoshop layers. It's the same image but made up of different types of layers. That's the dimensions are just holders of different types of information, but they're all really instead of being separate spaces, they're in this one space and coming. That's the experience I've personally had.
No, that
the
makes
one
sense.
problem, of course, is the subjective experience, and
Sure,
that entire problem of knowing if you are real and if anything you're experiencing is real, especially when you're in that wordless state.
Well, to me, the idea that when this happens, they also say that there is entanglement that occurs per individual. When the wave function is collapsing and propagating, actin is a chemical on the synaptic circuits that in a gel-like state acts as an insulator against the second law of thermodynamics, or essentially dissidence, which is what normally collapses a quantum wave function in nature. And in its liquid-like state, it helps propagate that biochemical energy through the neuronodes before it has an orchestrated collapsation. So it's like the only orchestrated collapsation of a quantum wave function in nature is inside the brain. And when this happens, subatomic particles can become entangled. And if that's the case, they'll always be entangled. So in a real sense, there's a part of you, a quantum part of you, that will always be entangled and also always be personal unto who you are. And if particles are in an entangled state, that means that they're vector particles and they lie outside of the space-time continuum, which means that they're not experiencing linear time. People who take DMT and who also have had near-death experiences have described this same sense of nonlinear time fading away and personality fading away. Because if you think about it, everything that you like, everything that you feel like, love, hate, or taste are chemical reactions between serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin in your brain. And these chemical functions transmitted through the neuronodes of the synapses in the brain are in and of themselves controlled by quantum functions. So there is a part of you that is unique and can only unfold in linear time because of chemical reactions being produced by linear time. So
Correct.
when these people have near-death experiences and when they take DMT, they often describe a situation where it almost sounds like terror, where you are everyone and everyone is you, and there's nothing to say because you know everything they know and they know everything you know, and there are no games of probability because there is no linear time, so there can be no veils. So everything happens at once, and it's a second and an eternity, and it must be the most boring place because I think most people choose to re-sleeve down into biological bodies and linear time on our planet because it's the only way to have any sense of adventure.
Well, I'll tell you this, and not only can you have that same experience with acupuncture, you can generate that experience by looking into someone's eyes long enough. And if you put your mind into the right state, you can actually swap faces. You will see your face in their face, and they will see your face at the same time. They will see their face in your face, and you will become the same person.
Yeah,
and
it's
you
like
can
a
do it
connected
while you're talking.
a way to make a connected consciousness.
I think that's a John Travolta
right?
movie.
You can actually do that, and the weird thing about it is you can see both their actual face and this superposition face overlaid over top, and you can see them see it young and old. So like if you use a mirror, you can see yourself young and old.
And you're essentially talking to that stripping away of the self, right?
Now, the reason why you abandon it, according to the Taoists, is twofold. One, when you're in that state, the rule is, how's the day going? Same as it does every day. It's always blue. It's the same day as always. When you're in that state, invariably, the sky will be blue above you. You won't have clouds. So it's a very... You could say blasé. I mean, if you call the kingdom, if you enter the kingdom, this is what it's called, entering the kingdom. It's almost kind of without any major flavor of everything going. The first sound you're going to hear when you leave that state is probably going to be sirens, because there's going to be the introduction of danger back into the life of interest. And the intellectual mind is what the Taoists identify as the thing that kills the mind of Tao, or the numinous mind.
I think Buddhists call that the monkey mind, right?
Yeah, you can call it the monkey mind. Hence in Tai Chi, the repulsing of the monkey.
Yeah.
It is the mind that schemes, and it is with you since youth, and it is protective. It is absolutely necessary for survival. Unless you were a perfect monk who could walk around from one moment to the other, and you could even meet psychopaths and you could converse with them as if they were you, But practically speaking, in our world of bills and taxes and such, the scheming mind or intellectual mind is favored, and it is so powerful. I have people that come in to see me, and that's really what's going on, is they can't stop that intellectual mind. They can't even control their joints. They try to relax, and their joints are resisting. They can't let me move the joints around during the massage. Everything is so live wire all the time.
Do you ever use music as a tool, like somewhere around 72 beats per minute?
Of course, I think I can't think of any healers that don't use music, sound, and I use also smell and of course light, and there's warmth, and
there's only one neural node in the brain that decodes olfactory smells.
The most important thing, and this is where it comes back to what you're talking about, is in the Huangdi Neijing. Speaking of Huangdi, in the Neijing Su Wen, he says Chibo. Huangdi asks Chibo. He says, "What is the best kind of doctor?" And he says, well, these days and age, you can't hardly call these people doctors. Most of them don't even know how to use all the 9 pulses, which is funny because no one today uses the 9 pulses. But this book is like 24 to 2,600 years ago. And but he says in the old days, the doctor didn't use needles, and he didn't use the tongue or the pulse. He just walked into the room, and he was present. And the technique is called Tong Shen Ming, which means penetration spirit light. And it is a quantum state that you induce in the room. And if you do it well enough, you can cause people to throw up disease. You can make them dizzy. I had an experience, if you want to hear it, of spontaneous. So I had a case where a mother brought her daughter, and it was a clear case of a mother affecting child. And I actually almost had to pull the mother off of the child. So she was forcing this child to get some acupuncture. This is an unpleasant situation for me. The child the spirit is currently disturbed because the child is not comfortable and is over afraid. So, which is always a sign of too much control from the parent. So the mother actually is coming over and like cupping the daughter's mouth to keep her from crying. And so I have to kind of intercede and get between them. So the mother, when there's pushback like that, she starts to feel there's a darkness that comes over in the room. So I start to feel really quite weird. By the time they leave, I'm like, this whole situation is really quite weird. There's bad energy in the clinic. So my Tai Chi students show up. This is the end of the day. The Tai Chi students show up, and my Kung Fu students are finishing their jumps, their frog jumps. And so we're standing in a ring, and I'm recounting this unpleasant experience, and we're all seeing each other, and we're smiling. We're connecting out the crown chakra. We're changing the field of the room. My assistant's verifying that my bad feeling, like there was a weird feeling surrounding this mother. And one of the Kung Fu students comes over, and he's standing in the ring now. He's in the ring. And I'm telling this story, and then I suddenly just get this feeling. I look over, and he's swaying, and he's looking at me, these really glazed eyes. And I just leap into action, and I catch him before he faints, and I catch his head, and I lay him on the ground. Everybody's like, whoa, what is going on? So I lay his head down, and I'm looking right into his eyes, and I can see this really bad energy. So I chase it out, and I press the Do-26, which is under the nose, to revive him. He comes out of it. And so here's what had happened. During the day at school, some kid had bullied him and had said something that really hurt his feelings. And when he went to the teacher told him, get over it. And he had buried that down into his chest. But then when he did the frog jumps and he got his heart pumping real high, there was a discord between the two vibrations. Now you have this really strong, positive, hot, yang energy and this dark, unpleasant energy. And the two couldn't remain together. And it basically was interfering with his whole vagus nerve, and he has other things going on. But anyways, his body just decided, hey, I'm going to reset right where you're standing, and he was really quite dizzy from the frog jumps as well. But what was interesting is it was when he entered the ring of us sharing this energy that forced this incident to come up.
Yeah. It was triggered then.
It was triggered. It wasn't only about the frog jumps. It was because he had entered in the discussion at that exact moment while we were clearing the area. Speaking of these quantum entanglements, ultimately, there's only two states according to all these ancient societies. There's good medicine and bad medicine, or as the Chinese call it, the Zheng Qi, which is correct, and the Bing or Xia Qi, which is evil. Right. Or twisted. The word Xia means kind of twisted. So not straight would be the ultimate implication there. So this word, Zheng, goes back, you won't be surprised, to the Saturn myth, to the cosmic pole, and to the concept of when the god fell, he fell because he was twisted. He had been eating his children, if anybody remembers the Kronos myth. And he had lost his duh. Now the character for duh, his duh, right? As in the Tao Te Ching, right? Everybody reads the Tao Te Ching, but they don't realize what the duh means. The duh, if you look at the character, is the heaven, and then it's the character for big, which the character for big refers specifically to the heaven man in the etymology. And then if you look, there's also a penis hanging off of the big. So there's a reference to his manliness. So to have duh is the ability to have a
it's
clear
like archetype for the Greeks, man.
Yeah, and your eyes, you can look straight into the another man's eyes and shake their hand. And it's also an energy presence. Of course, the Bible famously describes Jesus coming into town glowing. So there is an energetic gathering in the Taoist text, the Neiya. It specifically mentions that you have to gather the chi into the chest. And if you do, then the animal's claws, the men's weapons, and the heavenly disasters can't touch you. And all that energetic medicine has to go back to this Saturn myth era and to this concept of a divine right to rule, both the king's right and also as humans, our individual strength over nature, our place between heaven and earth. This linear connection from top to bottom. And so it gets very alchemical and Gnostic. So roundabout, long way of explaining Gnosticism.
You did ask that question too, didn't you?
Yep. I wondered how it related.
Well, that's where we wanted to get to.
That's where we started, right?
Well, and it does beg a question: what kind of Christianity were the kings of Glamorgan and Gwent? They weren't apparently too into the austerities of these bishops. They weren't into. They were much more into multiple wives and sex and fighting and
all the fun stuff. I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, they were very natural. So they were.
I know about multiple wives.
They were more like the Taoists, if that makes sense. They were, or kind of like barbarian Taoists, is from what I can tell. But they did have Bibles. They weren't uneducated men. They did have knowledge in the Latin and everything. But it is my speculation that when they chose the site for Camelot, this yellow hill, they chose it because of its shape. They chose it because obviously it was easily defensible, as we're talking like a 500-foot slope. It had a really great view down to the bay, which sits across from Bristol. And it has there's some natural springs. We talked about the sulfur springs. There's also not too far from there, Wales, South Wales is only natural spring that you can go visit to this day and go sit in bathhouses there. And then there was a ring of forts. And in fact, on page, let me see if I can find it here. Okay, on page 23, at the time I published this paper, I said that there was a vague hexagon. And I did not have proof of any forts inside the circle that I've posted. But for my birthday, my assistant got me one of the other very expensive Wilson and Blackett books. And in that one, it sure enough had that fort, and I've since added it to the map. And so if I zoom in here, I can actually tell you the name of this. Landrumni, and it fits exactly in that area. Now, I'm not saying that it's a perfect hexagon. Of course, the hexagon, we've gone over this on your show. The hexagon is the shape of Saturn's, I think it's the North Pole.
Right. Yep.
It's currently changing color as the brown dwarf is starved of its own ring current. It's essentially just radiating out all of its energy, and so the color of that hexagon is changing. There are rock arts, famously I've shown on page 79 in the Rock Art of Kentucky by Coy Fuller. There is a beautiful hexagon with the center circle in the middle is actually embossed, so there's just like it's like a bas relief carving, so that you can tell that they knew that the gods were spherical. Okay, it's not a flat rock art design, but it actually it sticks up at you. So this hexagon would have been also the symbol of the king.
Right.
Is my speculation, is that it is another indication of the divine right to rule.
So so the shape I'm looking at this. You said to go to page 23. So I'm looking at, it looks like a relief. Saturn motif, Big Turtle Rock Shelter, Kentucky, credit Fuller et al. Right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And this was, and that these exact images show up both in Kentucky, or this same type of imagery shows up in multiple places, right? And that's what ties this all back together.
The hexagon shape.
The hexagon shape.
Well, not only the hexagon shape, but this hexagon shape is obviously extremely old, and that would probably date this choosing of the site of Camelot back to at least just after the Saturnian age. It could have been in the Jovian age.
Wow.
But it would certainly date the Britons back, and this Camelot back way before anything else. Or if they had the religion when they came to the area, they would have chosen the site for its, sulfur springs, and then formed these other forts that you can see in the map around it. However, the hexagon shape is not really like a major part of the Wilson and Blackett work, right? This is just my going over why it's called the Yellow Hill.
Yeah.
They had different. By the way, they named their forts just like the Native Americans. And the Chinese, a red fort, a black fort, a white fort, a green fort, and a yellow fort. And the yellow fort would be also the center fort, because the center fort is the earth fort. Now, yellow is earth, and earth is in the center. And the symbol for earth to this day remains the Celtic cross.
Okay.
You know what I mean by the Celtic cross, right? It's the same cross, or you could call it the Knights Templar cross, if you like.
Right. It's with the circle and the cross, right?
Right. It's a circle. Hair. Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Because the tall cross is, of course, going all the way back to the Ankh, out of Egypt. But this circle cross. Now that cross is also found here in America in the Cahokians. At the some of the art that they've dug up from the Mississippian culture has that same cross.
Okay.
So it's not only over there in the old world or in China. It's all over the Chinese glyphs. Right. That Celtic cross is throughout all the characters that have to do with thunder or lightning, or spirit, or energy. All of those characters have this Celtic cross throughout it. And it's not my maintaining that it was Christians that formed the early Chinese. Some people will probably argue, and there is some evidence that has been shown by some preachers that are Christian and out of China, some Christian references in Chinese language. And it could be that they came from the Tower of Babel thing, and spread east, but that's not my contention. And it's certainly not my contention that the two were talking, because if the Welsh were a lost 10 tribes, then they went this way, and the Chinese went the other way. I don't think that they were talking to each other afterwards. So the only way that I could see them having the same motif is if they saw it up in the sky. And the Native Americans, when they talk about it, they call it the four winds. And this is, generally speaking, the worldwide references to streams of power or winds coming out of the center one god, which we are speculating that was actually Saturn losing its power rather than showing its power.
What do you think about a lot of the new LiDAR stuff? I don't know if you followed it at all. We were talking about China, but a lot of this new LiDAR stuff that's coming out of China showing things like pyramids and stuff like that. Is there a connection there, you think, through?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course. The pyramids have been known about for a while. The Chinese, for some reason, don't like to bring it up. It's surprising to me that they'll attach all sorts of tourism significance to everything from Qin Shi Huangdi forward, but and of course the Great Wall. But actually, the pyramids have been known about. Westerners have noted them ever since World War II. And some of the Victorian visitors had seen one or two, but of course they didn't know anything about them. And now they are really, really catching fire. People are starting to notice, especially they talk about the White Pyramid And the Chinese will not let any excavation go on to do with them. And in some of the sites, they close them off and don't. It's like worse than Zahi Hawass. Maybe that has to do with superstition. The Chinese government certainly hates religion quite a bit. They have they have a special disdain for Islam at the moment, but Falun Gong and everything else, they'll go after it. So I doubt it's particularly superstition in this day and age, and I don't think that Chinese archaeologists are superstitious about opening up the tombs. I think it's just another way of control. I'm sure within the next 500 years, somebody will finally get them to crack open and start looking into these pyramids. But right now, all we can see is how similar. I mean, there are pyramid mounds. There's pyramids on both sides of Africa in the Indian Ocean and in the Atlantic Ocean. On these islands, there's pyramids. There's pyramids everywhere.
Munaguni.
It's another pyramid.
Are you not down with Zahi Hawass?
I'm not a fan of anybody who says that he never got any progress by using science and measuring with technology. So and he's been a major barrier to Egyptology.
Yes, he has. Well, certainly he gets really upset if anybody suggests that anybody other than native plain old human Egyptians created the pyramids for burial mounds.
Yes, he likes to call everybody pyramidians, which is very clever. I have to admit,
have you actually?
Very clever.
You may not have because you're distaste for him. But did you ever see the very short-lived show that they had on the History Channel about him? Like his own series?
I haven't seen that.
Dude, I had to watch that, and there was it was funny because this is right before he became like he was just the curator of the Giza Plateau, but later he became like the head of the Egyptian antiquities, but it was right before that, and he had his own show so that he could wear his own Indiana Jones hat, right? And he had an assistant, and they were somewhere out in the desert, and the desert people had killed a camel and was fixing it up for them because they were guests, and his assistant was like, "No, I don't want to eat the camel," and he was flipping out, man, telling her she had better eat that damn camel and shit. He was just having a fit, and I'm like, oh my God, this dude's so intense all the time. He's like, he's got to have had a heart attack by now because he would just get mad. No, you have to say these Egyptians were very, very, he would get mad.
Yeah, he had a huge meltdown with Graham Hancock over the Robert Bauval stuff. And
over the what?
Robert Bauval. So he was supposed to debate Graham Hancock. And when he walked in and he saw Hancock had Robert Bauval's face, he got triggered immediately. And he said he wouldn't have anything to do with it. And then they got him to come back in, but all he would do is the Q&A. And he admitted he had never heard of Göbekli Tepe. Which was, of course, he's not going to believe that there could ever be any society before 4000 BC.
Yeah.
Since he had never even heard of Göbekli Tepe. And, of course, Graham Hancock jumped on him immediately. He seized the moment.
I mean, the vulture stela dates back to circa 5000 BCE, so, I mean, they can at least give the Sumerians that.
Yeah, he knows that, I think, probably, but
yeah, right. But he's not going to.
There's no way. There's no way that he would
not
ever
in public.
That probably that the original Egyptians were probably Sumerians, who were probably the Hebrews, because the Hebrews, when they wrote out all the ites, they left out the Sumerians. That's the only group they didn't write out, and the only reason you would do that is if you were them yourself.
Right, and you were trying to separate yourself from them, and you're going to go ahead and get rid of Asherah and just keep Yahweh.
Here's the question: How do you enslave millions of Hebrews in Egypt? Probably they were the population that was there when they were invaded.
Yeah,
and then they became the quote slaves of this invading new established monarch,
or they became mercenaries and laborers.
That's quite possible, but the bottom line is that you have to explain where they came from and where all this stuff and the they don't want to talk about aliens, so you gotta like you can't have it both ways, man. You
right? Yeah, you gotta have something.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So, anything else in this paper? I was noticing. I mentioned the cosmic towers, and I talk about also the shining city on a hill. And I think
John
the shining
Winthrop.
city on a hill, that idea still pervades to this day.
Reagan liked it.
Still the belief of a like a castle in the sky, a floating paradise city where things work correctly, and always have. That is, of course, really famous about the Camelot myth.
Yeah.
And it is my speculation that it was the British people themselves, the original British people, and then anybody who intermarried and inherited these traditions and passed them on or heard them from a bard who heard it from a bard who heard it from a bard and intermingled and told it his own way. Eventually getting down to the Renaissance Romantics who wrote down their own versions for French and Italian and Spanish people. That when they thought of Camelot, they were hearkening all the way back to this ancient Saturn myth concept of the Golden Age, without knowing it. Of course, they had no. They weren't like the Sumerians or the Egyptians talking about the superior sun, and there's not really a whole lot of proof that they were doing any kind of outward. I mean, the Druids were probably doing energetic practices, but we don't have any text because a lot of it was all burned. So in the stones, in the Welsh stones, there's no indication that they were talking about yogic techniques. But there's undoubtedly this consistent hearkening back to this primordial time of the perfect kings. And I think the Arthur tradition is one of the best examples of it's so closely rendered to it that you could almost easily say that Arthur isn't real because it's all metaphor. It's a lot like Jesus, right? And there's people that argue that Yeshua was not a real person, that instead there was a lineage or school that was creating an archetypal person to pass on their version of the religion and of these practices. And there is some validation to that. And I've heard that about the Arthur tradition. I've heard people say that this was a metaphorical king, the king who should be. That may be true in the sense that the Saturn myth harkens back to an original king that was the fertility god. And, he married himself and was father to himself and blah, blah, blah. But there's actually evidence of real buried people. And they did find a headstone for this guy. And they're pretty sure they know where he's buried. So if the archaeology would allow it, of course, the laws in England are very strict right now. And if it were to be allowed, they could go and excavate this tomb. And all these different kings, and throughout their books, they'll tell you where these kings are buried. And some of these places are still churches to this day that are used. And you can go and see a plaque, like the plaque for Arthur II's grandfather. That church still exists. And the reason why he was turned into a saint in the first place is that he died defending. He had already retired as king. He died defending from a Saxon invasion. These Saxons hadn't come to take over. They came to steal horses to prevent the Britons from invading them. And they penetrated really deep into the territory of the Welsh. And Arthur's father made sure that they didn't go home. But the grandfather died in that battle, and they put a church right over where he died because he said, I want to church here. So he was quite I guess you would say a tyrant, but for the British they considered him a really good king. He was a warrior king. And at that time, of course, everybody in those northern lands believed in a heaven for warriors.
Yeah, Arcturus, the brightest star, and Ursa Minor, bear, warrior. Yeah.
Yeah, there's this the Valhall, the concept of a. I guess you would say, like, instead of just a hell meaning like a cover or burial, which of course references a grave or a mound, right?
Yeah.
Instead of going to hell, you would go to Valhall, and there you could toast and live forever, etc. As a warrior who died well. So King Theoderic or Tudrig was quite revered, and his church stands to this day. Is my main point. So there were living people to this myth. I mean, you could call it myth after this many thousands of years. But the research, I do hope that people are willing to pick up if they want to go further than the Holy Kingdom, which is Adrian Gilbert, who's a pretty reputable alt-stream art writer, right? He's done Göbekli Tepe and a number of other things, Giza stuff. And if people want to pick up something further, they can do the Arthurix Rex Discovered or the King Arthur's Conspiracy. I know the man who currently holds the copyright for those books because Wilson and Blackett are really old. They don't care anymore. Their reputations were just tarnished and ruined by all these people, and they shied away from some of the best controversy. You know how controversy, it has the two-edged sword. You can actually make your career too.
Yeah, it sure can. Yeah.
Well, they were so paranoid about like being attacked and things that they sometimes published under pseudonyms, and they didn't even use the same pseudonym over and over again. So they diluted the knowledge of who they were and everything, because they had really experienced some unpleasant politics in Cardiff area, trying to raise awareness. So, anyways, the King Arthur Conspiracy. I know the guy. He can actually get people the print. They are expensive, but they're at least not $500 like what's been being sold online. So they're books that are worth reading. They're certainly a lot different than the Arthur myths that we came up with. They make a lot more sense in terms of being, I guess, how would you say, human, very human qualities. The typical human failings. You talk about a lot of backstabbing, brothers killing uncles and cousins, and just incessant warfare, which is pretty typical for the Dark Ages.
Lots of power struggles, stuff like that.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, these guys, but they would come together when they needed to repel a specific invader. But in the end, the pride of being your own king, I think, eventually it was doomed to lose to the centralized power that Edward brought. I mean, when he unified the island, King Edward, he didn't brook any rivals, and of course the Scottish hate him to this day. There's a whole video on YouTube which is really quite funny, debunking the historical inaccuracies of the movie Braveheart, and you could tell that whoever got together with Mel to write this, he was probably Scottish.
Man, it's really cool that you do this. There's a couple things here to point out because we're coming up on 2 hours, so we'll start getting ready to wrap up. But all of the stuff that you do has a current that runs through all of it. It certainly does. Like there's certainly a way that you tie everything back together. Yeah,
not that kind.
No pun intended, but sure, I'll take it. But so that and that you are taking a lot of this kind of more esoteric information that was written about and pulling this into sort of the modern age by having discussions about these type of works and things that a lot of people probably don't even know exist. So it's and you make this stuff very approachable in the sense that you provide all your documentation. You're very open about it, and we've talked about this a lot. That with you're presenting information here. Go take a look at it.
Well, we live in an age of soundbite and video media learning, and it's unfortunate because even the EU people have fallen for this a little bit. Now they have these great conferences. You can watch their conferences, and people like Eve Cochran will get up there and they will show you these quotes from Egypt, from Sumeria, that will prove to you beyond a shadow of doubt that they weren't talking about the sun that we look at today.
Okay.
And I'm going to read you some quotes to that effect after this point. But I set out to create EPEMC. Number one, I couldn't call it Electric Universe because it's copyrighted.
Right.
But I wanted it to be open source. I still invite other people, if you read the paper on what extended plasma electromagnetic cosmology is, and feel free to try it out. If you find that the hypothesis is not robust enough, after you've done some learning about it, of course, and read different ones of my papers, then of course critique it instead. It's in most of my papers when I present very controversial hypotheses, I also will provide my own criticism. For example, in the non-EPMC paper at the Great Pyramids of Kentucky, I very briefly mentioned diffusion. And then later on, I wrote a paper that followed that up, and I was proposing the possibility that the Cygnus-aligned mounds in Madison County, Kentucky, show not just the Northern Cross. They don't use the whole swan. They just use the cross. And we know it's the cross because there's Lyra next to it as well. So thankfully, they were nice enough to put Lyra so that we could know for sure where we were looking in the sky. And then they lengthen the top and bottom of the cross. And they lengthen the bottom of the cross more than the top. So it's really, really, truly a cross. And so I'm speculating that this is diffusion. Now, we're talking a Fort Ancient culture, so it would tie back to these Welsh Indians. But in that paper, I also go ahead and say where that falls apart. And the reason I do that is because I think in science you have to be willing to not just go for it. If there's an a priori assumption, the universe tends to come back and get you and say, "Oh, turns out you weren't right about that." And it doesn't matter. It could even Einstein has had these moments. Like the universe has always got this gotcha. If you make any firm statements about,
are you talking about lambda with Einstein?
That specific reference to what was I thinking of? I was
cosmological constant.
The biggest problem. Well, there's lambda, but the biggest problem is the Big Bang itself. But I don't want to knock on Einstein tonight. I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
Another podcast again.
I mean, even like I love Hannes Alfvén, but Alfvén himself tore down his own. He even said, you can't just use magnetohydrodynamics, and he did this at his own Nobel speech. To me, that is the greatest scientist, the one who can do something as great as that, as create a robust mathematical system as magnetohydrodynamics, and then come back and say, I was wrong about this because I left out electricity, and then warn against it. That to me is really the more impressive scientist. I'm not too impressed with rock star scientists who get into fancy math that doesn't prove out.
Like Brian Cox.
I won't name names, but I will say that superstring symmetry proved nothing, and it has been all quiet on the Western Front. They do not want to talk about it.
Sort of like Michio Kaku sort of thing.
Yes, well, and Brian Greene, all those kinds of guys. But all of them are silent. The whole thing is silent. And now what's happening is they are just jumping to inventing new types of dark matter, including, and you guys won't believe this, but it is totally true. They are speculating, it's mostly the Chinese doing this, dark matter that is 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000,000 times the size of protons, which would beg the question, where the heck is it? Because we certainly haven't been finding it. I mean, they are at this point, they're making a dark light. They'll probably make up invisible light next. Negative mass. I mean, there's more evidence for unicorns than there is for this stuff. So,
what about Monchos?
Same. There's not been any. There are massive, halo objects, but there are. They have not proven. Monchos have not proven out to be dark matter. WIMPs, axions, all of them have been constrained out.
Monchos sounds like they'd be good with dip.
It does.
Yeah, massive compact halo objects.
Halo objects
found around all galaxies.
Those exist. Those are a thing. but they have not proven to be dark matter. And also black holes have not proven to be dark matter. And axions have not proven.
Oh, we're getting ready to start another podcast here, Shifu.
I know. Anyways.
It's my fault. I keep trying to drag him into the space science thing. I'm sorry. It's like I'm just.
Well, we should do that.
Visit another time.
Right. We should do that with you guys then.
I do want to reemphasize that these texts exist and have been known to Egyptology. And I'm going to give you an example. These are translations by the famous Egyptologist Budge. So this is a really good one. I am the Lord of the crown. I am the eye. I am in the eye, my egg. I am in the eye, my egg. That makes no sense. My seat is on my throne. I sit in the pupil of the eye. That's the Papyrus of Ani. He who entereth or liveth in the circle, the Aten, gods of the Egyptians, by Budge. The sender forth of light into his circle, the Lord of the circles. Again, reference to Saturn's rings. Thou hast come with thy splendors, and thou hast made heaven and earth bright with the rays of pure emerald light. The Egyptian Book of the Dead. O Ra, the heir of eternity, self-begotten, self-born kind, king of the earth, prince of the netherworld, thou dost rise in the horizon of heaven and sheddest upon the world beams of emerald light. Hail, green one, Osiris and the Egyptian resurrection. And the last one here, you shall go upon the great west side of the sky and go down upon the great east side of the earth, the coffin text. So you go up on the west side and go down on the east side. And so begs the question, did the Chinese revere the south because it was the real north? I don't know. But in the Mayans, we have the same echoing. It was in the year called One Reed, and it said that he arrived in the sea on the shore of the ocean. He stopped, cried, arranged his belongings, and got dressed in his finery, his turquoise mask. And when he had entirely prepared himself, he set himself on fire. He put himself into the flames. And that is why it is called Talayan, the place where Quetzalcoatl was burned. And then it skips on, and after his ashes there were all gone, then the heart of Quetzalcoatl rose up as they saw, and according to their belief, it went into the sky, it entered the sky. The old people said that it changed into the star that appears at dawn, which is Venus. And according to what they say, it appeared when Quetzalcoatl died, and so they called it Lord of the Dawn.
So you're saying okay, so there's corroborating data from multiple or from different places that are talking about the same thing happening.
Yes. And so Saturn giving birth to Venus was a flare star. It was a flaring event. And there is a stone in Utah. And Rex told me on the Leak Project the name of the daggone stone. I just have to ask him again. That stone has a squatter man that looks like a woman, and out of the bottom of between the legs, comes out a giant comet planet. And this has all been recorded worldwide, from the Serpent Mound to Egypt. It's all the same one event. And I just hope people will go and look. It's your birthright. It's everybody's right to know these things.
Yeah. All right, so let's tell them, where do they find you? Again, it's academia.edu /
uky.academia.edu / SHIFU Careaga Careaga. I'm also on ResearchGate, so you can find some of these papers on ResearchGate. I only tend to put the hard science on there because I treat it like it's a peer review place, because I do invite people to come and attack the papers.
Where do they find you on social media?
Well, they should probably try and get into the group, either the Electric View or the Pulse. There's also the website for the Electric Universe Gateway is a good place to learn. And maybe you can link this one for them, but it's sites.google.com/site/Electric Universe Gateway. And that is a good place where a lot of information is embedded in. Also, every day I post new research papers because they are proving this electric paradigm they're using it in meteorology now. They're using it in geology, earthquake prediction, Harvard is on this. Yale is on this. China's on this. NASA, ESA, which is the European Space Agency, they are all going fully electromagnetic. Sometimes they forget to, you wouldn't believe this, but they will forget to put magnetometers onto things. Like the New Horizons that went out there to Pluto did not have a magnetometer on it. It is unbelievable, but it is all changing, and it's changing really fast. And part of that is because our magnetosphere is changing really fast. Right. And we're rapidly approaching 60% degraded, and it's gonna start to affect our lives. Of course, we're already seeing outages when social media and internet stuff like fails, and you're like, oh, that's weird. Google went down. That's weird. Well, it's not panic. Weird. It actually
Google went down. You better Google that and see why.
Yeah. Well,
Google what to do when Google goes down.
Right.
It's going to be. It's definitely going to be an interesting time. I'm not predicting any doom and gloom. Yeah. Although you got to wonder what happens when the pole flips. Does the Earth change direction?
Maybe there'll be a strategic coronal mass ejection at that point in time. Something. We'll have like a mini apocalypse and things will be better.
Not to scare you too much, but there are two events that should be of interest at least. One is either last year or the year before, there were some recorded moments when the magnetosphere dropped off for hours, and I just mean it just didn't exist. So we all got a nice tan that day. And then there was a period, I think it was in the 90s, I'd have to look this up, when the solar wind did not flow for like a couple days. The sun just was like, nah, no thanks.
Done.
And that's because of the transistor-like behavior due to the sun's arrangement. Now, the question is what's going to happen as we leave the cosmic dust that we're in our Milky Way and enter the local bubble. Ben Davidson at Suspicious Observers, he makes these really disastrous, and he gets paid the more he amps people up. So, I don't go that way. I'm not asking people to be preppers or anything. If you are a prepper, let me know so I can come and get your stuff when it's time.
Yeah.
But there are some interesting questions that come to the fore. Certainly, there was a period of time when mankind had to live underground, and we know. Between the Tepe period, when they buried all those T-shaped pillars, and Sumer, it just didn't appear like people wanted to live outdoors. And,
well, they find that's in
farm or whatever.
That's here in North America too, right? That there's
all over.
It's all over the world. Yeah,
dolmens all over the place. Yeah. Cave living. I'm not saying that we're for sure heading to that. I think we're smart enough that we can, and that's where eventually I hope we do the science fiction episode. And
yeah, that'll be coming up here soon, man.
And talk about some of the technologiches I want us to invent.
I'll have to get Eric back for that one too. He's a big sci-fi fan.
That'll be a lot of fun.
Man.
And of course I can't list every freaking technology that needs to be invented. So, but all of it is based on us harvesting. These cosmic currents. I mean, 9 million amps, folks. I mean, forget about a $20 trillion platinum asteroid.
Let's start transhumanism now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, let's. I mean, if we're not going to go back to living the right way with the land, and we're not going to be tribal, then we've got to do this thing right.
Yeah,
and,
baby.
Space. I mean, the space junk and the plastic bottles everywhere. This is not really the most intelligent way to go about it.
Not so much, man.
Yeah, it's a
deepest part of the ocean, the shallowest part of the orbital. Our shit's everywhere, man. We got to get all of our pieces in one geographical location, is what I'm saying.
I said this. I said this a couple days ago on Facebook. I said, well, what if the goal is to fuck everything up?
Check.
That's like, so mission accomplished,
right.
man. Maybe we're just looking at this backwards, completely backwards.
Well, I'm beginning to think that we might be doing a favor by bringing carbon back, but other than that, I don't really see any benefit to it.
I thought we're doing a favor by bringing some AI into the world, because they're going to look at us like we're some sort of a biological disease that just rapes things and moves on and destroys it and keeps breeding, and they're just going to put an end to it.
AI.
Well, I think actually we're just the epitome of what deer or any species would do. It's just I don't think there's ever existed a species so good at it. I mean, if you give a deer a chance, it will absolutely use up every resource in the area. But it's not exactly the smartest thing that we could be doing.
We talked about that last night. That bird that re-evolved and then. It evolves on an island, but it doesn't have any natural predators, so it loses its wings, right? And then and then every 20,000 years, the island floods and it kills them all because they can't get off.
But then another species flies in,
and then the island comes back and they start it over again.
Yeah, and they lose their wings.
I was like, man,
everybody escapes but those guys.
That is the dumbest fucking bird.
But nature's compensated, and it's like broke even. It's going to be that way for eternity. They're not going to get anywhere. It's like playing a game,
but
right?
For 20,000
you land on that island and you lose a turn every time.
Yeah. But for 20,000 years, they live like with no predators, with an unlimited food source. That's why they just
utopia, and then it's flooded like in every fucking story. You know, everything's great. Oh, great! Now we got a flood.
So they have their own. You know, their whole mythos gets wiped out and they start all over again.
Yep.
Well, Pat over at the channel Valuetainment, he says hard times breed strong people who create good times, who create weak people who make hard times.
That's right.
So
it's a vicious cycle.
You're kind of screwed no matter what. With my children, I know that they have it too well compared to when I was their age and it was the 80s. We were poor as all get out. So I try to make their life hard just to do it. So like today, they were vacuuming my car and they were doing all my stuff because they need that, I think, to toughen them up, to get them ready. I mean,
someday they'll thank you.
Yeah.
Boxing and wrestling. Yeah, they probably, I think they already are thankful. They love learning chess and different things. Before we go, I forgot to mention that in my paper, if people are interested, the entire King Arthur conspiracy map and the family tree, as I put it up on genie.com, and you can view. It's a flash enabled, so you could scroll through the whole family tree of the 4 King Arthurs, and you could see all the distant relations and stuff. I think I put up about 140 names of that family tree. I didn't go through all their bishops because they have whole sections of their research devoted to just the frickin' bishops. So the bishops were also princes and kings, and they were related in the family, but instead of becoming
church and state,
they became bishops.
No separation of church and state there, huh?
No, they did not have a separation because they had this, like I said, they had a charter system where the king owned the land, he would grant it to the church, and then the church would grant the king entry into heaven. So they had a mutual.
That worked out well, didn't it?
Excellent.
It was an important part of political life, and so he could be excommunicated, and that meant he would go to hell, and so then they would have to make up and kind of get along so that he could be let back to heaven. It's really funny. But it's quite practical. If you
and a theme nonetheless that shows up over and over and over again too. Isn't that funny? Right? I mean, it's crazy, but
you could argue a lot of aspects of our society, despite the intents of the founding fathers, or maybe if they were Masons, maybe because of it.
Right.
And there's a lot of evidence, especially Ben Franklin.
We know at least the majority of the original signers were.
Yes.
There was only, I think, 6 signatures that were questioned.
They would have passed on and considered it vital to pass on these ancient Egyptian and Middle Eastern Saturn myth ideas, keep them alive in order to keep our society as top dog, because of course you want your tribe to do well. And you could argue that the technology, even of fractional reserve banking, could only be devised by a society that had access to the concepts of unlimited power. But that's an entire philosophical discussion.
Here we go. We're going to start another podcast.
We'll branch into libertarianism, and then we'll be here forever.
3%. All right, man.
Now let's discuss John Locke.
No, let's don't.
Yeah.
Good.
Absolutely.
God, here we go.
No, but
a little Bastia, and we'll just break it all out.
Some Rasul.
Little Ayn Rand. All right, Shifu, thanks so much for joining us tonight, man. I really appreciate
Thank
it
you.
and doing this. And, well, this is the latest episode with you. There will be definitely more coming up here.
Yeah.
And make sure you check us out there, www.noshitcast.com, KNOWSHITCAST.com. And you'll find all your links to where you can download and consume this podcast media. And we're on YouTube. Make sure you hit the like and subscribes over there. Keep them comments coming, folks. We love it. And we'll catch y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.